Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today at AfroTech. My name is Terrence Williams, and today I'm so happy to be here with you. And I want to thank everyone at AfroTech for making this conversation possible. I am a designer and very much an advocate of more inclusive design spaces. And so today I wanted to talk to you about designing Blackness. And that sounds very lofty because it is. And it really touches on how Black designers can be their most authentic self in workspaces, amongst their peers, etc. So I'm so glad you've joined me for this session, and we'll get into it. Again, as I mentioned, my name is Terrence Williams. I'm a senior design lead at Salesforce, and I work on a team called Salesforce Design. And basically, I work on advocating on behalf of our designers and our audience, elevating their stories, sharing and amplifying their experiences. And so, as a designer of color who's also queer, I've had to navigate a number of spaces where I may be the only one or may not always feel as connected. And so I've had to learn to build my community as time has gone on. And today I want to share with you how I've been able to do that. But before I jump into those things, I always think it's helpful to be vulnerable and show a bit of who I am as a person, just so you know my perspective and where I'm coming from. So let's move forward. Um, my name is Terrence, as I've mentioned. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a designer and visual artist living in San Francisco, California. And I also serve as a global comms lead for the Black ERG at Salesforce, which is called Bold Force. And I've really relied on design to help me build connections, not only with community, but with others in roles that may seem a little, higher up, execs, understanding what they need to say, how they want to communicate. This has really forced me to think of ways to communicate with folks who I may not relate to immediately and finding that common ground. And I think where I come from, as you can see on this slide, is really the influence for that. I grew up in a small rural town in Western Kentucky. And so growing up in my state, I love my state, but I'm not oblivious to the challenges, the opposition I faced growing up there and as a Black and queer man. So, you know, as a creative, it's always hard to find that expressive outlet. And so I really had to find ways of expressing myself in this environment that was very conservative, very religious, what have you. Environments that may not have always welcomed me, but I was able to find those outlets in creating and drawing and writing and finding others that were creatives as well. And on this next slide, I'm a child of the 90s. And so I grew up during that era when 90s sitcoms were, everything for me. Seeing Black 90s sitcoms in particular with predominantly Black casts and hearing those stories and seeing that representation in the media really influenced me, really touched on how I saw myself and others. And you see this visual here. I was watching Fresh Prince, I was watching Martin, Family Matters, Living Single, and I've heard other creatives and even famous figures, Black figures, say how these sitcoms have influenced them. I know Issa Rae has talked about how these sitcoms have impacted her work and how she writes. And this definitely was true of me as well. Seeing that representation helped inform how I viewed myself and how I created work. And I want to move forward to, talk about those ad campaigns also of the 90s. These campaigns, and I was a child, so I was looking at gaming ads, toy ads, and that really impacted me. And I love seeing the layouts and the type and the color. I didn't really have the language or the tools at the time to understand what I was looking at, what was resonating with me, but it was that design. It was that ability to communicate and share a message in these fun ways and impactful ways. But I also noticed, a lot of those ads didn't really highly feature a lot of Black kids. At least, at the time, it started out very slow. There was always kind of like the friend in the background, but I never felt like the focus. And that was true of some shows as well in the 90s. Outside of that that realm of Black sitcom. It was kind of like we were contained in this space, and it always intrigued me, like, why would we not be part of what is considered mainstream America? Why are these ads that are aimed at mainstream just seemingly not talking to all the audiences that existed and lived during those times? So that's something that stuck with me as a young person and to this day. And I wanted to move forward and share this quote with you from Dean Broadley, who is a BIPOC South African born designer and a speaker. And he gave this talk called Not Black Enough to Be White. And he talks about his experiences growing up, obviously in South Africa, but there is a quote he shares, as you see here: who we see thriving in the world teaches us how to see ourselves. And although I saw examples of Blackness thriving, it was very noticeable that that was not the primary, the mainstream. And that caused me to have a lot of questions about what the media was teaching me, who was creating it, and what their intention was. And it also forced me to think, well, gosh, if I don't see people like me who are Black, who are queer, necessarily thriving in some of these more corporate spaces, as I grew to understand what marketing and advertising was, that wasn't necessarily something you would immediately see attributed to or associated with Blackness. So I want to move forward and talk about how some of these things, inform my perspective. So there were really three key points that came out of this for me. And on the slide, you see it says finding my power. So even though there was that limited representation in the media, there was that lack of creative community in my space growing up, but I kind of had to really find and struggle to find those peers. And just that longing and that desire I had to see and hear from people like me with my shared experiences, my values, to see that representation. All of those things may have sounded really heavy and in some ways negative, and that is true. But at the same time, I found power in that because I knew there was an opportunity to change these things. And it didn't come immediately. It took time, but it was something that inspired me to want to study design as a profession, to go to the University of Louisville in Kentucky, which is where I got my BFA in communication art and design. All of that time, all of that, going to college, seeing what others were producing, I always had these principles in my mind as my goal. It's kind of like my secret goal of like, I'm going to change this. I'm going to do this when I get the skills and the tools I need. So if I move forward, this is a statement actually from my own article I'd written about my experience as a Black designer in tech. Knowing I was perceived as different is something I learned to embrace. And that's kind of been a little mantra for me. I've accepted the fact that others may not relate to me, may not see eye to eye with me, especially when working in tech. Design is changing. It is, I love seeing that it is getting more diverse, it is getting more inclusive. It's slow, but in the beginnings, early 2000s, for me, I didn't really see a lot of that in where the spaces I occupied, where I worked. I didn't really have the mentorship, or at least mentors that looked like me. And that was something that just stuck with me as I experienced the microaggressions, as I experienced the unfortunate, conversations or judgment that would sometimes happen working in agencies, working in consulting. And so it definitely was a bit of a blow. I think I was a little naive growing up, thinking about who was creating those ads, who was creating those experiences. I never really thought about how they would either welcome or not welcome me, how they would react to me. But all that aside, I still was able to create work and meet peers who were supportive. And as you see on this slide, what really got me inspired, especially as I found my career at Salesforce, educating others, telling stories and elevating the stories that weren't getting told. You see a couple of visuals here. These were just like some assets I created, print booklets to, making visuals for a conference. such a wide array of assets and creative output, but at the same time, always in the foundation, I was thinking of how can I make these more inclusive? How can I show different types of people in these visuals? How can I show a different point of view? And I'm going to move forward, and you'll also see some creative on the screen right now where I started getting a lot more intentional about what I was designing. Instead of designing and trying to make it an ad more inclusive by having more diverse people or personas, I just really dived into making designs about equality, making designs about community. As you see here, equality, justice for all is on this t-shirt. And this was something that was done for our Black ERG group here at Salesforce. It is a very intentional, direct message. And there's always this line of towing what is going to empower a community, but not make others feel necessarily excluded. And that to me has been really delicate. I don't shy away from speaking the truth, if that makes sense. But at the same time, I want to make sure that everyone knows they can be a support, they can add their voice into these messages and visualize it. I think the visuals just make it more impactful and more of a connection with the audience. So I was really feeling good about some of this work I was producing. It seemed to be on message, it seemed to be true to my values. I felt like I was helping get a message out there to people that may not be thinking about equality or equity in the ways that I was at that time. And then something happened that really just changed my perception of everything. And on this slide, you'll see a photo of Breonna Taylor, who was fatally shot in her home in Louisville, Kentucky. And this was in March of 2020. This impacts me a lot for various reasons. As I mentioned, I'm from Kentucky. I went to college in Louisville, and I knew people like Breonna. I have family in the West End to this day. I knew that experience. It really just hurt to see this happen, first and foremost. And it just hurt to know that I left this place and it really hadn't progressed as much as I thought it had. And then it made me question my work and what I was doing with design. Was my work really impacting people in the way it needed to? Or was I just making things that had a fluffy, nice message, but weren't really driving impact and driving change? I really want to drive change. And so this was something pivotal for me. And it just made me reassess and stop. How was I designing? How was I using design? How was I showing up as myself in these spaces? Was I being true to myself? And speaking my truth in the way that I thought I had been, to really challenge the status quo and challenge the way people in corporate think of these issues. And so that's what inspired me to really be vulnerable and write about some of the experiences I had in tech. And as you see here, this is just the headline image from an article I did for our Salesforce design medium. It was called Designing My Blackness. And I had to acknowledge some things. I had to acknowledge some truths about myself. I was in these spaces, thinking I was really, standing up for what was right and being truthful and challenging people to think, question their biases and question how they were treating others. But at the same time, and we all have done this, and it is based out of navigating a space of code switching, of trying to make sure that I maybe didn't show up in a way that was threatening, or maybe didn't show up in just my authentic Blackness as I'd wanted to. And it was kind of conscious yet unconscious. It's like, how could I have let this space mold me and shape me, thinking I was doing the opposite, but in many ways I was still trapped within this idea of what I thought I was when it came to corporate or agency or wherever. And so that changed my relationship to tech, it changed my relationship to design. I had to be really honest with myself. And in this article, I talked about things I experienced, not having mentors that looked like me, and how that probably impacted me and absolutely did impact me. Not being able to design in the way that I wanted. I was so inspired by those 90s sitcoms I mentioned earlier, that bold color, that liveliness, that imagination and just Blackness showing up. And I had subdued that in my work because I had peers telling me that was too bold, it was too much, it was too loud, all this coded language that I hadn't really processed on a deeper level and challenged on a deeper level. So it brings me back to my present day. On this slide, we see this term relationship design. And relationship design is a philosophy that I've worked on with my team here at Salesforce Design. Now, it was defined and shared in terms of creating experiences that focus on connections that are driving engagement and social value. This was, of course, with design in mind of a business framework, but I actually took it a little step further. I think it could also be applied to personal networks, personal connections, and relationships. And that is a huge part of how I now look at my work and how I connect with others. And just to go through on this next slide, you see there are 4 mindsets of relationship design, and I'll click through them. First is courage. Courage meaning having that courage to have those hard conversations, those brave conversations, being able to speak to something that is uncomfortable or a moment that is uncomfortable and say why. Next, we have intention. And intention in terms of designing for the unintentional, really being purposeful about what you're putting out there. I started to think about the type of work I was doing, why I was doing it. What did we need to create this message? Do we need to share it? Who is it actually helping? When you really start thinking about the intention of something, it opens up so much. Next is compassion, and compassion to keep it human. So I think sometimes what happens in tech spaces, especially, we get really focused on product. What is the product doing? What are the features? What is the content we're putting out there about the product? But then we forget to humanize that. We forget that this is for a person at the end of the day and their experience. And the same can be applied to our relationships. Are we having compassion? And we are, I heard this somewhere, and forgive me for not being able to remember who said it, but, being honest, and honesty without compassion can be cruel. So always thinking of how to apply compassion into how you communicate your ideas and share and treat others. And then last was reciprocity. And that was just reciprocity to mutually benefit and grow, not just expecting something, not just taking, but also not just giving. It is about balance. And that is how I think we learn and grow and ourselves and others. Sometimes we get in a space of giving so much and burning out. And on the flip side, we may not be, paying it forward. So how do we find that balance and make sure we're doing both? So these were just the core principles or mindsets of relationship design. And then I kind of paused and realized that, as you see on this slide, I had been designing relationships most of my career, and I didn't even realize it. We all network, we all make connections, but I had to stop and actively think about how I was applying these principles to my life and the people I connected with and learned from and taught. And that just helped me really understand that I could be getting a lot more out of these relationships. I could be giving a lot more to these relationships, and they could do more in terms of building a stronger community and making things happen. So I wanted to talk about what that actually looks like in practice. As you see on this slide, back to these mindsets, but I wanted to kind of talk through how I was applying them. When I look at courage, I think of, dealing with my peers, my leadership, who weren't necessarily fully on board with my way of thinking or wanting to collaborate with me for whatever reason, how I navigated that, how I spoke up to that and said, hey, I'm recognizing this behavior, I'm seeing this behavior, calling it out sooner versus later. And taking that risk, it is very uncomfortable, but it has to be done. And I just, for me, it became more about having that courage in that moment versus sitting with something that wasn't right or did not feel right. Another example, speaking up when I experienced microaggressions. And, we think of like, yes, speaking up to stop that behavior, but also to educate. Some people don't even uh, realize what they're doing. And those that do realize what they're doing, it's important to call them out in those moments when you feel comfortable, when you feel ready, because it's up to us to teach folks how to treat us. For a lot of the time, I was moving through these spaces and hoping to be treated well, hoping people would see my value and know I needed to speak to that and speak to my value and be very strong in that opinion of myself and let others know that I do bring value and I am worthy of being in this space just as much as they are. Last encourage, I'll just say, reaching out to those who I felt could teach me and mentor me. Sometimes we see folks we admire and who are doing work and doing things that we really love. And then we have that sort of pride or that fear of like, well, I don't want to bother them, or I don't want to reach out to them in fear of rejection or them not understanding. And honestly, get rid of that. Reach out. You never know what that person could offer, and vice versa. You could be teaching them something as well. Talk to folks, connect with folks. It is worth your time. I want to give some examples of intention, how I practice intention mindset and work as well. So being more strategic, and I mentioned this, really thinking about what I was putting my time into, what kind of design work I was giving my energy to. Was it something that really aligned with my values that I cared about? Or was it something that was kind of just fluff? It didn't really impact anyone. It didn't impact the communities I wanted it to impact and encourage and uplift. And so there was a lot of work I started saying no to once I started being a little more intentional about what I was doing and how I was thinking of it and approaching it. Same with producing any other type of creative work, whether for work or myself. In professional spaces, sometimes people's excitement can permeate, and sometimes that's great. Sometimes that someone else can bring a perspective that you didn't see, and you're like, actually, yeah, this is worth exploring. But I think it's also important to discern what is worth exploring and what actually does align to your values versus just doing something because it has the momentum and it seems like it would be a good idea, get you seen, get you promoted. There's always going to be a balance of those two things. But I lean heavily on what brings me joy and makes me feel good as well. Then compassion. So for me, that was just humanizing any project I was a part of. If there was a message for an event, if there was a project or a product launch, how could I humanize that conversation? How could I humanize that content? Make it connect, make it feel real and authentic as much as I could. And that can be very hard in tech spaces. Sometimes there's a lot of bureaucracy at play. But I think when you start to speak out that truth and really share, like, hey, I'm not feeling that this really resonates. I don't know who's this for, who's this meant for? You start to get others to think of these questions and question it as well. And I think better work comes as a result. Also, and kind of going back to the values, ensuring those values and perspectives that I held dear were being expressed. Are we being caring? Are we being inclusive? Are we showing that the values we claim to have as a company or an individual actually are manifesting in what we're putting out there? And last, reciprocity. For me, it was just ensuring that I was giving as much as I was taking, whether that was people's time, work, or creative work that I produced, volunteering, whatever it was, making sure I was learning and growing and thriving as much in that, and also enabling someone else to have that same experience. If I found something really valuable, I wanted to make sure I shared that with others who may also find it valuable. Not hoarding, not being protective of work, but using that work to inspire others and get other people on board to create something perhaps even better. Perhaps you're collaborating and you both make something together that's even better. And I touched on it just a moment ago, but giving back to the community, because we can, as individuals, create this great projects and workers, teams, or whatever it is. But I feel like if it didn't really give back to an audience or drive social good, what are we doing this for? What was really achieved as a result? So I'm going to move forward um, and really say, how could you start designing your own relationships? How should you be starting? And I have another quote here that I really love from Nedra Glover Tawwab. And this was an interview I saw of with her on a YouTube channel called Women of Impact. She shared this statement, and I found it so powerful. You can't even find community if you're not being honest about your story, if you're not being honest about what's going on, who you are, your background. That's how you find your people. You draw your people to you by being vulnerable. And that is so true. And for Black designers in tech, that vulnerability can be very hard to get to. It can be very scary to be vulnerable. We feel like we risk so much, and because we are. And I had to go through that. I had to process that. But ultimately, I was willing to risk that and be vulnerable because I needed to create a better experience. I needed to find others that also wanted to create that better experience. And I needed to team up with them. And so I wanted to just talk through a few ways I went about that. As you see on the slide, I learned from my mentors, courageous mentors to be specific. I found people that I wanted to mentor, and sometimes mentors would find me, but I think it's always important for you to choose or be open to who is mentoring you. There needs to be some shared values. There needs to be some shared aspirations and goals, and you can learn so much from these folks. And it will, when you see how they are treating you and others, it informs how you will mentor people when it's your time. And that's what you see on this next slide. Share your knowledge, share with others, mentor others, uplift them. If we don't do that, we break the chain, we break the cycle. This cycle is important. You learn to give back to others, and that is how the community starts to form. You want others in your peer groups to be thinking how they can improve, whether it's design or a designer's experience in an organization, or an initiative you want to do outside of corporate, maybe starting something completely new. That's how you find that community. And then lastly, connecting to the compassionate peers and the shared values, as I said. Because once you start to form those relationships, and that could be peers and colleagues, but it could also be family and friends. It could just be people in your community, designers, non-designers alike, creatives, non-creatives alike. We all learn from each other, and we can support each other in different ways, especially when you're building a team or a part of a team. You want people with different perspectives. You want people to bring something to the table that you may not be aware of or may not foresee. And you will do that for them as well. So I have this slide here. As you see, it's Naomi Osaka, who I think is just doing so much amazing work and building herself. But I made this little case study, and I wanted to show how she actually implements a lot of these practices in her work, in her career. So, you know, Naomi learned to me from Serena Williams. When Naomi won the US Open in 2018, Serena congratulated her, comforted her. She was overwhelmed, she was young. There was a lot happening at that event in terms of what many saw as unfair treatment to Serena, the audience reacting to her loss and booing, but not necessarily booing at Naomi, but booing at the situation. And Serena stepped up as that mentor, comforting her, giving her a shoulder to cry on, literally, telling her it was okay. And that to me is exemplary of leadership and mentorship. And then, I go to the next circle here, sharing that knowledge and mentoring others. We literally saw Naomi do the same when she did beat her opponent Coco in the next Open, but Coco was very young, emotional, as understandably so. But Naomi literally did what Serena did for her, comforted her, showed her, told her it was okay. You're still awesome. You're great. You can do this. And showing that support system, especially among women of color in an athletic profession. And then the connecting piece, Naomi has openly said she doesn't keep friends long, and you can take that how you like, but she does have a close network of people that support her. She talks about her sister and how that has been a big part of her life as they were homeschooled and grew up together. So, that's a peer that shares her values, that understands her, that is a part of her support system. And this is just an example of her power. Like Naomi finds her power by drawing from all of these things, and builds community by drawing from all of these things. And I just found that so interesting. And this next slide, you see, building community. We can use each of these teachings, these areas, using those mindsets, learning from others, sharing with others, connecting to others, to build our own community and to build our own power. That is our power. When we are Black designers in these spaces and we don't necessarily feel seen or heard or appreciated, we have to show that worth, know we have that worth, whether others are acknowledging it or not, and calling them out on that if it's not being properly addressed. We have power. We have power. That's what I wanted to leave you all with. Use these teachings, introduce some of your own teachings. You may find that this can be the start of just getting you thinking differently. And you might be able to, please teach me, reach out to me if there is something that has worked better. Because that is how community is built. And that is how we are going to be able to build these communities and spaces that are safe for everyone, inclusive for everyone, especially Black designers that may have to experience, less than ideal situations at times in tech or other places. But we have that value, we have that worth, and we are amazing at all that we do. And we will build that community for ourselves. And so I just want to say thank you as we wrap up. I am happy to answer any questions if there are any in the chat. And I thank you all so much again for being a part of this conversation. And I hope to see you all out there building community and sharing with others as well. Thank you.